So theoretically, the PowerPoint slide on the Industrial Revolution should help you, give you the basic technologies of the Industrial Revolution. That's just all I'm doing. Here's basic what it is, how it happened. And then next week I'll do another PowerPoint on sort of the working class and the working conditions, and we'll sort of go from there. These are just little snippets that I can throw in. And I'll see if I can find some other things too as we go. But I wanted to add a little bit here that, I don't know, maybe self-indulgent, but perhaps it'll help illuminate things. And I'll give you a little family history. And we talked earlier in the class about backgrounds of your families and where they came from, and it sort of, as we're getting through the Industrial Revolution, it sort of helps think more about these family backgrounds, right? My uncle, on my mother's side, my mother's brother, did a lot of family research going back, and he managed to get back into the 17th century, in about the mid 1600s. So this is on my mother's side of the family. And it's rather interesting. We can't track back further. We basically lose track of them. There are records there. There are parish records for births, deaths, marriages, and so forth. But unless you know where, there's so many parishes around that it's really hard to track. And it's interesting that they show up as farm labourers. The Rawlings family as farm labourers in the 17th century, right at the time when we're getting a big burst of enclosures. And I can only surmise here, but we're getting this large group of landless wage labourers during the 17th century, and this second wave of enclosures that'll lead to parliamentary enclosures. And I'm thinking that this family are dispossessed peasants. They were tenants on somebody's land and were dispossessed by enclosure in right at that peak time, 17th century. And they show up in a village called Teddington in Warwickshire, which is in the middle of England, as farm labourers. And they're basically living in a cottage. And they are working on people's land. Probably with no or minimal access to any commons by that point. Certainly, as we go further on, that's gone. And we see them as farm labourers all the way through the 19th century. One of my relatives said, well, God, we have a boring family, but, that's what we were. Landless farm labourers, that massive proletarian class of wage labour who are decreasingly having even access to the commons. So they're just plodding along in Warwickshire, in the villages near or in Teddington itself. So it's not moving far. So they have some reliable, apparently, work. And that goes until my grandfather, and this can take us into the Industrial Revolution, my grandfather, who in the 1920s, I'll do a slight detour here. In the 1920s, he decides to try and, he was born in 1907 or 1908. 1908, I think. So he's a young man in the 1920s, late 20s, okay, around the time of the Depression, actually. It's like everything's gone to heck. And so what he does is he goes to Canada, and he goes to work as a lumberjack somewhere in Western Canada. And there's some stories he tells which are kind of fun. But there is lumberjacking because there was nothing in England. He does that for a few years and then goes back to England sometime in a few years later, in about 1933. And then meets my grandmother. And they get married, and my mother is born shortly after. And then he becomes a factory worker. And this is the important part. He becomes a factory worker. So the movement from country to factory, which is what we're talking about at this point this week, next week, especially next week, of the land labourers, if they just can't find reliable work or a good living, is, you know, squished off the land and having to work in the factories. Now, of course, he's doing this 100 years later than the early process when we first get the factories in the early 19th century, and the process is beginning then. But, you know, so he's 100 years later, but it's the same deal. No real opportunity in the land. Let's try and move to the city and the factory because at least it's work. But in the 1930s, it's the Depression. It's still miserable. You know, they try and unionize, they're all fired, and you're only working 6 months of the year because that's all there is to produce, and the rest of it you're scrambling to get through. Again, no access to commons. They did have vegetables and chickens in the backyard and so forth, but on your own plot. But you're basically, the 6 months of the year you're not working in the factory, and even when you work in the factory, you're just barely getting enough money. Just trying whatever odd jobs to get by, and then, you know, supplementing by whatever you can scrape up in your garden. But that's sort of the classic case of from being peasants to farm labourers to factory workers, although the timeline, you know, is longer than some others. On my father's side, by the way, we've only gone back to the 19th century. You haven't done as much research, and they're all bricklayers, all the way through to my grandfather for several generations, which is basically going to our artisans book. My grandfather was a master bricklayer. He was a master, served an apprenticeship, and became a master bricklayer. It's that whole traditional process of work, learning your skill, becoming a master, becoming a fairly skilled, reasonably paid, but it's wage labor, right? This is at the point, even in the 19th century, where these master bricklayers are not sitting there and sort of working with others to build a house. They are paid by a contractor who builds lots of houses, and these are wage laborers. So you've got the old system, apprenticeships, masterships, and the old sort of craft system, but it's in a wage labor capitalist environment. You're working for a capitalist. So on my grandfather's side, that's sort of the urban link of it. I might talk a little bit more about that if it fits later on. But I thought that might, if you think about your own families and how they fit in this transition from in this 19th, 20th century.